Welcome, and thank you for joining our program tonight. I'm Sarah Bloomfield, Director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Tonight, we commemorate Women's History Month by honoring the life and legacy of a truly extraordinary woman, Sarah Guralnik Shapiro. I was fortunate to have met Sarah and her husband Asa many years ago when their son Mickey was appointed to the museum's governing board. They were a lovely couple, but I must confess that even though I was generally aware of Sarah's story, it was not until seeing the powerful film, My Name is Sara, that I had any idea of what she endured and how she prevailed. Sarah's story is a timeless one, but it's also timely and inspirational. How often in the past year have you thought about the need to face challenges with resolve, to just summon the determination to cope and adapt, and the resilience to keep on going? Of course, our challenges pale before Sarah's. She faced infinitely more horrific and incomparable circumstances. But in doing so, Sarah shows us the way. Time after time, as she's thrust into a world of terror and uncertainty, she confronts life or death decisions. She seems to have endless reserves of ingenuity, courage, and perseverance, and of course, dignity. I'm continually inspired by the many stories of how the victims maintained their dignity in the face of such an overwhelming assault. Sarah has much to say about that too. And one more thing is that Sarah, like all the survivors, reminds us what truly matters in life. And that begins with family. And that's why we're so grateful that Sarah's son, Mickey, and her granddaughter, Lisa, are with us tonight. The museum has had a wonderful partnership with the Shapiro family for a long time. Sarah's and Ace's testimonies are part of our collections. And I'm delighted to announce tonight that their children and grandchildren have generously named the entrance to the museum in their honor. We are deeply grateful to the Shapiro family for choosing our institution to pay tribute to Sarah and Ace's remarkable legacy. Before we begin, I want to thank our partners in this program, the USC Shoah Foundation, Strand Releasing, James Lucy Productions, and Eventive. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to our moderator, the Washington Post's distinguished film critic, Ann Hornaday, who will lead us in tonight's discussion. Hello, Ann.
Hello, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It is truly my honor to be the moderator for tonight's discussion. For those of you who haven't seen the remarkable film, My Name is Sara, it shows the incredible courage and perseverance of Sarah Guralnik in the face of the unimaginable. As a child, Sarah fled a ghetto in Oritt, now in Ukraine, first with her older brother and then later alone. For almost 2 years, she disguised her identity and hid with a Christian farmer and his family while enduring grueling conditions to survive the Holocaust. All around Sarah, ordinary people were faced with incredible pressures to survive the brutal war. To commemorate Women's History Month, we will focus on Sarah's legacy and the challenges she and other women faced during the Holocaust and continue to face today. Our conversation will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll shift to your questions. So please ask your questions in the live chat. I also encourage all of you to please stay through the very end of the program when Sarah's granddaughter, Lisa Gold, will share her insights on this extraordinary woman. So let's begin the conversation with Mickey Shapiro, Sarah's son and the executive producer of My Name is Sara. Welcome, Mickey.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's great to see you. And Stephen Oritt, the film's director. Welcome, Stephen.
Hi, Ann. Thank you.
Greetings to you both. So, Stephen, let's start with you. I'd like to ask you, how did you first learn about Sarah's experience during the Holocaust, and how did you make the decision that it was best captured in a dramatic film?
Well, Mickey Shapiro is one of our executive producers. Another executive producer partner of ours, Andy and Trotter, is a mutual friend of Mickey and myself. And Andy was the one who really told me about Sarah's experience. A few years prior to there ever being a concept of the film being done, Andy and Mickey had taken a trip to Ukraine, retracing a lot of Sarah's steps. They went to Oritt, the town where she was born, as well as the villages where she hid. And really through that process, I think both of them were really illuminated from that experience. And Andy came back and told me about it and just how incredible it was, and promptly sent Sarah's testimony to me. And I watched Sarah's testimony first, the USC Shoah Foundation, which is on your left, and then the testimony that she gave a few years prior with the United States Holocaust Museum on your right. And both of these testimonies were very consistent and lasted about an hour and a half in each. And I watched both of them really agog. My jaw was just on the floor watching her recount this story, the experiences that a young child had to endure, and ultimately in order to survive. And I found it to be extremely compelling. I thought that it showed a perspective from the Holocaust that we had not previously seen in much Holocaust material, films, books, or television series. And really for the fact that it focused on so much of the nuance of the experience, not so much the camps or the brutal acts of the Holocaust, but really much more of the relationships that this young child had to forge in order to survive. And that's ultimately what really drew me to the material.
Indeed. Mickey, I'd like to turn to you, and I'd like to show our viewers an absolutely wonderful photograph of you and your mother, which was taken in the displaced persons camp. Yes. What a special image that is. Both of you come shining through in that. You were very young when your parents left Europe to start a new life in America. Give us a sense of what your mother was like while you were growing up, and the values that she instilled in you and your brothers.
My mother was a very good woman, a very fair woman. She wanted her family to be educated. That was education and religion were very important to her, especially education. She wanted all of us to be educated. She wanted her most important thing in her life was her family. And she didn't care about money. She didn't care about jewels. She didn't care about anything but her family. It was very, very important to her.
Well, we have another terrific image that is a testament to that. I really want to share this with this. Look at that. Look at that. That is a great example of what you're talking about, right there. What was it like growing up in such a close-knit family, knowing that family was so very important? What was it like as a kid growing up?
Well, it was very, very nice. You always felt the love and the warmth of your parents. It also was a little difficult because when they came here, nobody spoke English. They had no family, and it was hard. But she made the best of it. And my father and her made the best of what they had. And fortunately, my father was very successful, and it turned out really well.
You know, I'm gonna cheat a little bit. We have a wonderful question from an audience member, from Karen Kruger. When did Sarah tell her story to her family? Karen says, my mother was a Holocaust survivor who would never speak of her past. And Mickey, I understand it took a while for your mom.
It took a long time. We would talk, and she'd always say, look, what happened to me, you don't want to know. And we would just leave it at that. We heard a lot of the story, but not the whole story. And it took years and years for her till she was like in her 50s to start talking about it. And then we knew more and more. But she didn't want to talk about it.
Right, and as we know, that's not uncommon at all.
No.
You did have the foresight to realize how important her memories were as a piece of Holocaust history. I'd like for us to listen to a part of Sara's oral testimony, which was recorded in 2007 at the museum, where she describes how she hid her Jewish identity from the farmer and his wife who took her in, and how she worked and how hard she worked to survive. Let's listen. Let's watch this clip.
Sure, thank you.
And he says to me, "Aren't you Jewish?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And she says, "Well, what can you do? What do you want to get paid?" I said, "A piece of bread." And she said, "What can you do?" And I says, "Try me." And she says, "Okay." And I stayed there every day. "Are you Jewish? Are your mother was Jewish?" I said, "No, not at all." And I worked very hard, very, very hard to please. And I didn't know from one day to the other day if I'll survive.
It is so sobering to listen to that daily tension she endured, which is so, I think, so beautifully dramatized in this film. That was so palpable even years later. I want to tell our viewers that Sara's testimony, as well as that of her husband Asa, will be available on a link in the chat feature for viewers to hear more, and I urge you to take advantage of that. This is an excellent time to welcome our guests, our audience. We have people from all over the world. We have people from Halifax, Canada, Venice, Florida, St. Paul, Minnesota, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania, Santa Monica, California, just to name a few. We have a global audience tonight. We're thrilled to have everybody here. And please continue to send your questions in the chat, because I know it's going to be a really rewarding conversation, and we'll get to those later in the program. So Stephen, you came to know Sara later in her life, after she had started to speak a little bit more openly about her experience. So how did she describe to you her ability to survive?
Well, I first interviewed Sara in 2015. I flew to Michigan and had a little lunch with Mickey and Sara and Asa at their house. And Sara was unaware that I'm a filmmaker and that I was interviewing her for the basis of making a film. That was Mickey's decision, and he felt as though it would have been too painful for her to be aware of that. So we really just started speaking freely and kibitzing about life and then her experiences. And the first question that I asked her was, how does a young child survive such a thing, survive the unimaginable? And she said immediately, by listening and not talking. And at that moment, it really crystallized for me who the character was and what she had to really do in order to survive. And she expanded a bit and said, I only spoke when spoken to. And I just thought that was a really beautiful theme to launch off on. I think that listening is a lost art these days, and too many people like talking. Without her survival was due to the fact that she was just a wonderful listener and was able to pivot and make all of these instinctual decisions, right, left, repeatedly, the right decisions though that led to her survival.
That's so true, and especially for such a young girl. This is a 12, 13-year-old girl who had the instincts to be able to do exactly what you're saying, pick up on all of those signals. And I think that helps us understand why this story lends itself to a dramatic feature rather than maybe a documentary, right? Because you're talking about a character, a woman, young woman, who for a lot of the movie is silent, and we're kind of experiencing that world through her eyes, through the extraordinary eyes of your lead actress, Zuzana Zarovi. But so tell us a little bit about finding the right actress to play Sara, because she needs to be very bottled up. She needs to keep her emotions in check at all times, but she's also the character that needs to lead us emotionally through this story. So please tell us about the challenges of casting My Name Is Sara.
Well, we shot the whole film in Poland, I should mention. We did the pre-production and all the development work in Warsaw, Poland. And so we started casting in Warsaw, which has a wonderful film community there. Tons and tons of talent, both in front of the camera and behind. And initially we started seeing professional actresses in all throughout Europe in the age range of 10 to 18. And nobody fit the bill, either through their performances or just the way they looked. And at that moment, the casting director and I, Nadia Lebick, decided to open up the casting and do an open call where we would start looking at amateur actresses. So she went to 6 different cities in Poland and put up flyers in these cities and Facebook posts, and saw about 175 young women in each city, and sent me links to about a little under 400 of the best of those 6 cities. And I was on vacation in Florida. I remember watching one of the cities, and all of a sudden this dynamic face came onto the screen through like a home tape audition, something that her father did at their house. And I immediately called my wife over. I said, honey, you got to look at this. Look at this girl. This is Sarah. I was so confident at that point that this young woman could perform what we needed her to perform. And I returned to Warsaw a few weeks later and started doing castings with not only Zuzana, but some of our other picks through the 6 cities, and matched them with our professional actors, Eric Lubas and Michalina Olshanska, who played the lead actors. And Zuzana, match for match, was right with them every step of the way. And I asked both of them to really, don't hold back, lean into her, see if you can make her uncomfortable, see if you can stump her. And she could not be stumped. She was one incredible, raw, young actress. And based off of her performance, and then a few conversations with her and her whole family, because it was very important for me that her family was in support of this effort, I felt as though we found our Sarah.
No, there's no doubt about it. And I'd like for us to look at an example of this extraordinary young actress in action. There's another picture of her, again, with those eyes, those haunted eyes, working with you on the set. Just the extraordinary, again, to me, this is a performance of instinct and just supreme self-possession, which is just so rare to find in someone so young that we haven't seen before. She's a real discovery. It's thrilling. And they say that 90% of directing is casting. So well done, sir. Well done, Mr. Director.
Thank you.
Let's look at a scene. There's a scene in the film that really shows Zuzana's extraordinary ability. And this is one of the rare scenes where she does show emotion. It's the goodbye scene with her mother, which I gather from previous conversations with Mickey and others that it's pretty true to life. Let's watch this clip.
Herr Hauptmann, hier ist alles für morgen vorbereitet. Sehr gut.
Pamiętasz, co macie robić? Tak. Idźcie tylko w nocy. Trzymajcie się z dala od drogi. I jeśli was złapią, nie zapomnijcie zmówić szamana. Opiekuj się swoją siostrą.
Jak tylko przyjdziecie pod ogroceniem, zerwijcie je. Tylko nie rzucajcie ich byle gdzie. Schowajcie je tak, żeby nikt ich nie znalazł. Rozumiesz?
Nigdzie nie idę, zostaję z wami.
Jeśli ta staruszka nie będzie chciała was przyjąć, powiedz jej, że sama się zgodziła.
Nie zostawię was.
Mój ojciec zapłacił jej dużo pieniędzy. Musisz przeżyć. To będzie nasza zemsta. Musisz zrobić wszystko, co będzie trzeba. Obiecujesz? Powiedz to.
Obiecuję.
It's obviously a powerful scene that gives us such an insight into the drive that Sarah had to survive, to keep that promise to her mother and to her father. This is a good time to bring in Zuzana Zorovi. We're getting lots and lots of greetings and well wishes to Mickey and his family and friends from all around the globe, and lots of people coming in from Poland, Zuzana. So you're not alone in staying up late tonight to be a part of this really special event. So we're thrilled all of you are here. Zuzana, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You give an amazing performance in this film, Zuzana. How did you prepare to play Sarah?
Before said, I had lessons with an amazing Polish actress, Paulina Puślednik, and we were talking about character, about Sarah's relationships with her friends, with her family, with her brother. And we're trying to find similarities between me and Sarah to improve my performance. Of course, there's no way I can compare to her, but we're trying to find something that can help me improve myself. But on a set, I become really close friends with Michalina Olszańska, who portrayed Nadia, farmer's wife. And honestly, I cannot express how supportive she was. I mean, everyone was, but Michalina gave me so much heart. For example, sometimes she stayed on set longer just to be with me during my hard scenes, just to talk with me. Actually, we talked every day about everything, about performance, about Sarah, about movie, about our personal life. So we had that connection, and I think that without her, it wouldn't be what it is.
That is so beautiful, especially because you have such an interesting your two characters have such an interesting relationship in the film. So it's interesting to me that you had that trust, that you had developed that trust with your co-star, and that probably allowed you to do all of the complicated emotional things that you were called on to do together. Mickey, I can only imagine how powerful it must have been to watch this unfold as an executive producer on the set. You were there for lots of the filming.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like for you?
It was very tough. There was good and bad to it. It was hard to go back and see it, but when I watched Susanna and how she came through, it made me feel very, very good. And this is part of a story that must be told. And watching the whole cast, they did a remarkable job. And Steve did a phenomenal job as a director. He got everybody to really do the best. And it was nice to watch, and I felt good about it. I felt really good about it.
I'm glad. You should be incredibly proud of this accomplishment. And circling back to the fact that your mother didn't share a lot of her, was reluctant to share some of her experience. Did the movie illuminate any, fill in any blanks or illuminate anything that maybe you didn't know before? Did you learn anything?
I basically knew most of it, but listening to it and then watching it and seeing it happen, it's a different story. And it's so hard that I can't watch the movie anymore. It's very difficult.
I completely understand, but again,
But I'm glad. But I'm thrilled I did it. I'm thrilled that it came out so good. I was very, very nervous. I didn't want to make this movie. I got talked into it by my co-producer, and probably one of the best things I've ever done in my life. I'm just so thrilled with it, and I'm so happy to share it now, to watch and the response we're getting, and it's just wonderful. I can't tell you how good it is. I feel really good about it.
Well, we do too, and I understand your hesitation because you don't want to. This is precious. These are precious things. This is a precious story.
Yes,
It's a
thank you.
sacred story,
Yes.
and to kind of give it over to an artist and trust him to interpret it correctly and appropriately and in a way that can be an emotional experience for the audience. That's a huge leap of faith on your part.
I was
So
plenty worried.
I can understand that. I can understand that. But you did your leap of faith was the correct one. So we're all very grateful that you made it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Susanna, you grew up in Poland, and of course, Poland, as a site of World War II and the Holocaust, I know that as a young person, you were really educated in these events. These aren't news to you or new to you. But did making the film teach you anything that you didn't know before?
Well, that's right. We are very aware about everything that happened that time because we learn about it at school. We read about it. For example, in the middle school, we're going to visit Auschwitz, which is only 1 hour drive from my house. So I knew a lot about everything that happened during World War II. But there's one thing I realized while getting to know Sarah's story. Even though all of the stories like her are all about the same time, all about the same brutal acts, each of that story is different.
Exactly. Each story is different, and each has its own moral weight and importance. And so, we almost can't get enough of them, especially when they're done this well. But that's the caveat, is that they must be done well, and that's the miracle of this film. I'd like to remind our viewers to send in your questions to the chat. We will get to them later in the program. Another great strength of this film, and one of the reasons we're playing it for Women's History Month, is that it does pull the lens back, I think, to explore sort of greater issues about war, and especially the unique hardships women face during wartime and during World War II. There's another character in the film, a young Jewish girl who shows up at the farm where Sarah is hiding, and we have a clip of this scene. It's where Sarah is trying to help this girl, but also trying to preserve her own life and her own hidden identity. It's a fascinating scene. Let's watch this clip.
Where are you from? Rivne. But I can't go back. I'm looking for somewhere to stay. I have gold coins.
Don't show them. Not to anyone. They'll know you are a Jew.
I am not a Jew.
Make the sign of the cross. Like this. Right, left.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see the Hail Mary? If you want to live, you have to learn it.
But it will be all right. No one thinks I'm Jewish. No one.
Well, you can't stay here.
I'm Rachel Dubner.
I'm Mania Romanchuk.
It's such an intense scene of the pressures. Again, those just a couple of the pressures that Sarah was under during this period of time. I'd like to bring in museum historian Elizabeth Anthony, who's joining us from Austria. Hello, Betsy.
Hello.
Betsy, can you help us understand what it meant to be hiding in plain sight? That's that's sort of a catchphrase, and it might not even do justice to what was just, as we see in this film, such an arduous experience. But what would it have been like for someone like Sara to maintain that cover for that long a period of time?
Well, survivors who hid in plain sight, like Sara, had to keep their Jewish identity a secret. And this film portrays how she assumed a non-Jewish identity. This was one way Jews could try to hide at that time. Sometimes people obtained false identity papers, like birth certificates, baptismal certificates, things like that would help them to prove the non-Jewish identities they'd taken on. In Sara's case, she didn't have official papers to conceal her identity, but she was raised with Jewish and non-Jewish Ukrainian neighbors. She went to school with Ukrainian children and even attended religion classes with her non-Jewish friends. This gave her skills, tools that she needed, for example, to recite prayers and invoke the rituals that helped her to blend in. Here we see a photo of Sara from the film. She's in church giving confession to the priest. Being a girl also helped Sara to conceal her identity. Boys and men had a harder time hiding in plain sight, as circumcision could give them away as Jews. The film touches on this when Sara strikes out on her own without her older brother, as they recognize that this would make her chances of survival more likely. Economic vulnerability is a common challenge to women in conflict situations. Even though Sara was so young, she used certain assumptions and expectations that society had about women to her benefit. She was willing and able to work in a traditional female role as a domestic servant and nanny, taking care of the children, performing chores for the home, working on the farm. Here you have several photos from the film that show many of the ways that Sara worked for the family. She knew she had to make herself valuable in an economic sense for herself and with her help that provided support to the family that took her in. The fact that she took on a role that someone much older would normally assume is especially remarkable. Sara needed to find a way to live, so she had to accept working for a family that mistreated her.
Betsy, why are Holocaust stories like Sara's less commonly known? Is there evidence that people, those who did sort of hide in plain sight, were a little bit more reluctant to tell their stories, or waited until much later to tell them?
Maybe, or not necessarily. It's not uncommon that Holocaust survivors with varying experiences have difficulty discussing traumatic memories. Sara's personal story is unique, but it includes many elements of survival stories that were actually common, just largely unknown. I think this is one of the reasons this film is so very important. Hiding in plain sight happened, but for a number of reasons, we just don't hear these stories very often. First of all, many weren't successful. People were caught and killed, and their stories died with them. But also stories of successful hiding in plain sight aren't always told. Sometimes rescuers don't want to be revealed as rescuers due to negative responses they think they'll get from neighbors or family. Sometimes survivors don't want to be revealed as survivors, and in some cases, they don't want to be revealed as Jewish. Sometimes they just maintained a non-Jewish identity after the war. In the US, more familiar Holocaust stories are about survivors who emigrated out of Europe, but many survivors who hid through actual concealment or hiding in plain sight often stayed in their home countries or hometowns afterwards. That was the case, at least briefly, for Sara when she returned to Oritt for a few years after the war. Like many survivors from that region, though, she ultimately made her way to a DP camp in Germany, and she did eventually emigrate to the United States, where she made a new life for herself and raised a family. And also, as we heard Mickey and our audience member mention earlier, survivors often have a difficult time sharing painful memories and experiences with their children. Sometimes they just don't or didn't. Psychologists have studied and shown that there are intergenerational patterns I've also seen in my many years of work with survivors and their families. And that is that it can be later in life, actually, with the third generation, the grandchildren, that survivors begin to speak and share. And in addition, survivors frequently will share even more with interested and engaged people who are not family members at all. I've experienced this myself in my work at the museum with our many survivors who volunteer here, and in the course of my research conducting interviews with survivors.
That's fascinating. Stephen, I'd like to bring Stephen back to talk about this fascinating dynamic that this film sort of hinges on, which is Sara is in this family, the farmer and his wife, like I said earlier, she develops this kind of uneasy alliance with the farmer's wife. I don't want to spoil too much of the film for those who haven't seen it, but this is such a female-centric movie, and I was wondering how intentional that was on your part, or was it organic? How did you go about structuring this in such a fascinating way?
Well, I would be lying if I said it was intentional from the start. You know, what drew myself and Mickey and Andy to making this story was the story itself. I'd like to say that, you know, every survivor story is exceptional by virtue of the fact that they survived. Some are a bit more harrowing than others, but the fact that Sara's story was something that really dealt with more of the collateral damage of the Holocaust, the emotional collateral damage of the Holocaust, than necessarily, as I mentioned earlier, the barbaric acts of it. That's really what thrust us into it. And, you know, I love hearing people point that out and say that it's such a female-centric story, because in addition to myself, Andy, and Mickey, the next person that we hired was a screenwriter, another man. And then we hired a bunch of women, fortunately. So, I think that it was something that I was conscious of. I'm a father of a young daughter, of a young girl. And so, you know, I was continually looking through her eyes, really, when approaching this material and making the film. But yeah, it wasn't, we didn't all get together and say, we should make this film because it's a young woman's story. But my gosh, you know, I could not be more pleased and proud that we're sitting here honoring Women's History Month, and that this film is doing so.
Well, you did a great job. And again, just the layers, you know, the complexity. It's one thing to do a woman's story, but then to bring in all these other kind of competing dynamics. I just think you did a beautiful job with that. Betsy, let's pull that lens a little bit further back, even still, and talk about how this film helps us understand the kind of unique weapons of war that were not only used against women during the Holocaust and World War II, but are still with us today.
Well, the film examples of a range of conditions and vulnerabilities particular to women during times of conflict. Discrimination against women is often magnified in these situations. During times of war, women are especially vulnerable to be targeted for death, exploitation, and sexual violence. During the Holocaust, women were a disproportionately larger population of ghettos that were used to segregate and confine Jews. They were more likely to stay behind to care for young or elderly and ill family members, while more men than women fled and went into hiding or joined resistance movements against the Nazis. And from ghettos, many women were sent to camps, death camps, whereas the men deported from ghettos were often sent to labor camps. And two, because women tend to live longer than men, a larger portion of the female population in ghettos were elderly women. All these factors contributed to a higher number of women subject to deportation to death camps, and therefore more women were actually murdered in camps than men. Plus, when groups of men and women arrived in a camp, they were segregated by gender. We see this practice illustrated here in this photo, which is one of a famous series of photos of Hungarian Jews arriving at the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Unbeknownst to them, these women and children are waiting to be taken to be murdered in the gas chambers. Women of all ages were more often sent to their deaths because they were more likely to arrive with and to stay with small children and frail elderly relatives at the time of selection. Women who were not murdered but selected to work in places like Auschwitz-Birkenau endured the humiliation of being shaved of all their body hair, standing naked in front of men, being subjected to sexual exploitation and violence. The loss of hair and the sexual vulnerability that nudity represented for women, along with all of the frequent taunting and touching, added to the trauma and shock of arrival at a camp. Women and girls are vulnerable to sexual abuse and exploitation in times of war. This was true during the Holocaust and remains true today. Sexual violence in times of armed conflict is as old as armed conflict itself. You know, it wasn't until the 1980s that scholars first began to examine women's experiences of survival as different from men. That means it took almost 4 decades after the end of the Holocaust to start to acknowledge and explore gender differences during those experiences. Our museum's own Joan Ringelheim was one of the first to study this important distinction. And it was almost 20 years after that that we began to pay attention to sexual violence against women during the Holocaust. Films like My Name Is Sara and the recognition that women's experiences during war are different from men make important discussions like the one we're having tonight possible. And when men and women participate, I can only hope that women will eventually be better protected and respected.
Mm. Well said. Well said. I'd like to take this chance to welcome back our other panelists, Mickey, Susanna. We have lots of wonderful questions from our audience, so I think I'm going to dive right in. And I'm told that the number one question of the evening is that people are asking why the film was made in English rather than Polish. So who wants to tackle that one?
I'll take it. So it's pretty easy answer. We made the film for an American audience predominantly. We felt as though we were making this film for an American audience. By virtue of that, we decided to make it in English language as the majority of the language being spoken. Sarah spoke a number of languages in order to survive. She spoke Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Yiddish, and Hebrew, and vacillated between those 5 in order to survive. But we didn't want to make the bulk of the film in a foreign language. I should mention that this was my first feature film, our lead actress's first acting experience whatsoever in a foreign land 10,000 miles away from my home. And I felt as though by making it in a foreign language, it would encumber us that much more. And I didn't want to stack the deck against us too much.
Understood, and approved. Audience question number 2. What kind of reception has the film received in Poland?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Susanna, you can talk about that, but I'll quickly say that the film has not been released yet in Poland. It will be. We will be releasing it there theatrically, most likely towards the end of the summer. But because Susanna is just such an incredible touchstone for our film and has developed such a following over there, I think every Polish kid between the age of 13 and 18 who's on Instagram is familiar with her beautiful face. But she can chime in any more from her perspective if she'd like to.
Well, I think Stephen said everything. I mean, all of my friends are waiting for having a chance to see that film, and I cannot wait too. So we're waiting for the summer.
Indeed, everyone's
obviously
waiting.
My fan number 1 and our film's fan number 1 is my mom.
Of course. Well, you know, and this brings up another good point, which is that a movie like this, when I was watching it, I watched it as a mother, thinking what a wonderful means of communication with Susanna's generation. I mean, this is just a terrific way to bring these stories to life for younger people. Somebody else wanted to know, and Mickey, I'll direct this to you. Did your mother ever meet the Ukrainian family again?
No, never, no. She never went back. She never stayed in touch. She had no contact with them. And we were supposed to go to visit many years after, and she was ready, and then at the end she said, "I can't do it. I just can't go." So we just left it alone.
Indeed. Stephanie Barrett would like to know, and this is probably, Mickey, another one for you. How was it that Sara was so successful passing, I think it was, she was passing as Ukrainian Orthodox. Is that the religion that was being practiced there?
Yes, that was the religion. And she went to school, and that's what she was taught. She was welcome to go to those classes and watch them. Her friend was Manya Romanchuk, and they shared a lot of experiences about that.
So Manya Romanchuk was a real person.
Yes, it was. That was her friend in school, and because of that, she learned a lot and spent a lot of time learning the religion and a lot of things about it, and it helped her. That saved her life.
Saved her life. Oh, it's extraordinary. Rachel Brown wrote, "I was curious about the portrayal of the sympathetic priests and the less than positive portrayal of the partisans. Were these portrayals based on fact or done for dramatization purposes?" And Stephen, I understand the priest is based on a real life character, right?
A composite, and there was a real priest. We know that Sara went to church every Sunday with the family. The family was a religious family, so therefore she would have had to have accompanied them. Sara didn't talk too much about the priest or what the rituals were in church, but we intuited that she would have had to have gone through confession, one of the scenes that you saw, one of the slides that you saw earlier, taking communion, again, because this would have been, all key to her survival. As you mentioned earlier, and one of the challenges in having Sara as the main character is that she's very closed down for most of the film, and she's a passive character. And it's screenwriting 101 or filmmaking 101. They teach you that you want an active character. You want somebody who's going after what they want, because therefore it sort of draws the audience in with them. But again, in order to stay true to the story, we couldn't suddenly turn Sara into one of these active characters. So we used some dramatic license to fill in some of that emotion that Sara would not have been able to show. So, for example, the priest, we created this relationship between the two of them, and ultimately reflect a lot of the emotion that was happening within her, but she couldn't show on her face on him. The partisans, that again, no specific mention of any specific partisan characters that Sara called out in either of her testimonies or interviews with us. But again, we really stayed true to enormous lengths of historical accuracies to make this film. When we first started developing it with USC Shoah Foundation, Stephen Smith, their executive director, had a very big influence in terms of making sure that we were staying historically accurate, along with a number of other historians and ethnographers here in the States and over in Eastern Europe. We wanted to make sure that we got that right.
We have a note from Sarah Gatti asking, Mickey, what displaced persons camp were you in with your mother and father? I grew up in a displaced persons camp. Do you remember the name of the camp?
You did? I was in Wasseralfingen, is in just next to Stuttgart. And it's still there. I went back. Well, the homes are still there. I went back 5-6 years ago and visited and saw where I was born and where I lived. And it's still there.
We have a question for Zuzana. You were absolutely fantastic in the film. Agreed. What are you going to do next?
Thank you, first of all. I don't know, actually. I'd love to become a professional actress, but we'll see what happens.
You have a very bright future, young lady. I don't worry about you one bit. We're all very lucky to say that we will have known you when, we'll all remember this night. That it's a real thrill for all of us. Before I get to the last question, I just want to acknowledge the beautiful, beautiful comments that we've been getting from Mickey's family, including David and Amy, who sends a special hello to Mickey. Your mother's resiliency and courage shine through. Mickey, can you tell us, what do you attribute that to? You knew her best. What was it?
She's what you see in the movie is who she really is. She was a strong woman. She was a good woman. She was determined. Listen, she lived through things that none of us have, and at a very young age. At 11, 12 years old, when you lose your family, and you lose your brothers and your mother, your sister, and your father, it makes you, changes you, and she overcame it, and she overcame a lot in her life, and she's just a strong, good woman. And very smart, by the way, very smart woman.
I wonder too if it goes back to that promise, that clip that we saw. I mean, my understanding is that was based on, that she did make that promise to her parents, and she took it to heart.
Oh yes, and she would always remind us that that she talked to her mother, that promise, that she kept that promise, and she had to survive for her mother, and thank God she did.
Amen to that. Well, our time together is almost finished. I want to thank everybody, all of our panelists tonight, for such a provocative, important, and very meaningful discussion. Thank you all so very much for sharing your time with us. I also want to thank our co-presenters for tonight's discussion and for making the film available prior to its theatrical screening in the fall, COVID willing. If you haven't already seen the film, or if you want to see it again after tonight's discussion, you can still view it through this Saturday, March 20th. Before I turn the program over to Sarah's granddaughter, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And I want to let you know that the museum produces many live programs. What made tonight special is that we learned about one young girl who overcame countless hardships and survived the Holocaust in Europe. Imagine what other young people were doing at the same time. We invite you to join us on the museum's Facebook page on Wednesday, March 24th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time to learn how young Americans responded at home and abroad to the Nazi threat. Now, I'd like to invite Sarah's granddaughter, Lisa Gold, to share a few words with us this evening. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Anne. It's an honor to close tonight's moving program. My grandma and I were very close. I was her only granddaughter, and she always made me feel so special. I love this photo of the two of us. I was 15 years old, and I keep it in my room, and I see it every day. I lived a few blocks away, and we would visit often. I remember sitting around the dinner table, being offered plenty of homemade Jewish food, and having meaningful conversations. My grandma would give me the most impactful advice out of anyone else in my life. When I was 11 years old, my grandma gave me this gold horseshoe necklace that I'm wearing tonight. I found out later that my grandma was just 11 years old when the Holocaust changed her life. This necklace is one of the only items that she kept from her childhood, and I wear it for all of the big moments in my life and when I want to feel especially close to her, like tonight. Growing up, I knew that my grandparents were both Holocaust survivors, but it wasn't something that we discussed. I didn't begin to grasp what that meant until I was a teenager. The first time my grandma spoke about her Holocaust experience with me was when we visited the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I was 14 years old, and we were on a tour of the museum when the docent encouraged her to share her story with me. I remember where we were standing in the museum when she began to recount some of the painful details. My grandma was shaking. Her words were sparse, but powerful. I only remember one other time when she talked about the Holocaust with me. I knew that this was an important and difficult experience for her, so I was careful not to push for too many details. I learned even more about my grandma's experience after her funeral when I saw My Name Is Sara for the first time. I was so grateful for the sensitivity that went into producing this beautiful film and for bringing her personal story to the screen. Soon after my grandma's death, I became pregnant with my daughter, who I named in her honor. I wore this gold horseshoe necklace that she gave me the day that Sara was born. I wish that the two of them could have met. Even though they weren't able to meet in person, my daughter Sara embodies characteristics that my grandma possessed that likely saved her life. Incredible perception and intuition. What wonderful traits to inherit, and a beautiful connection to my grandma. I would like to thank the museum and the co-presenters for producing tonight's program to honor my grandma's courage, her will to survive, and to celebrate her incredible legacy. And as we learned tonight, many of the challenges she faced continue to affect young women today. As we honor my grandma, I hope we can also do more to ensure that vulnerable young women are better protected in society. Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.